The moment Donald Trump stepped into the glamorous charity gala wearing his iconic red MAGA hat, whispers rippled through the crowd. No one could predict that his bold accessory would ignite a chain of events that would leave millions inspired. The grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the gentle strains of live orchestral music. Guests in glamorous attire moved gracefully through the space, their laughter light and measured. Then Donald Trump entered. The red MAGA hat perched on his head was impossible to ignore, a bold contrast to the sea of glittering gowns and black tie formality. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a current. "Is that him?" a woman near the bar asked, leaning toward her companion. "With that hat," the man replied, raising an eyebrow. "He knows exactly what he's doing." Trump walked with a confident stride, greeting a group of businessmen near the center of the room. He shook hands firmly, his expression calm. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. "Evening, Mr. Trump," one of them replied, glancing awkwardly at the hat. "Didn't expect to see that here tonight." Trump smiled faintly. "Why not?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't seeking an answer. Across the room, a woman in a sleek black gown folded her arms, her gaze fixed on Trump. "Bold choice," she said to the man beside her. "Or calculated," he replied, swirling the wine in his glass. "Let's see how the room handles it." As Trump moved further into the ballroom, more heads turned. Some guests tried to mask their curiosity, pretending to focus on their drinks or conversation, while others openly watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. At the far end of the room, a group of younger attendees exchanged hushed remarks. "Is he serious?" one of them asked, their voice barely audible. "He doesn't care," another replied. "That's the point." Trump paused briefly near the dessert table, scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the stage, where the event host stood chatting with a colleague. From across the room, the host caught sight of him, her smile faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. "Looks like she noticed," someone murmured. "Hard not to," came the reply. The ballroom's energy shifted as Donald Trump walked further into the room, his red MAGA hat commanding attention. Whispers grew louder, rippling across tables. "Is that really him?" someone murmured near the bar. "With that hat," another added, shaking their head. A young staff member standing near the entrance exchanged uneasy glances with a colleague. He hesitated before stepping forward, smoothing his tie nervously. "Mr. Trump," the staffer said, his voice polite but uncertain, "a moment, please." Trump turned, his expression calm but watchful. "What is it?" he asked. The staffer gestured toward the bustling room, his gaze flicking toward the hat. The organizers wanted to remind guests about keeping the focus on the evening's mission. They're asking everyone to avoid wearing potentially distracting items. Trump glanced around at the murmuring crowd, his eyes steady. "Distracting? What do you mean?" The staffer hesitated, his words catching in his throat. He straightened, his tone quiet but insistent. "They're concerned it might take attention away from the event's purpose." Nearby, a guest leaned toward their companion. "Did you hear that? They're asking him to take it off." "Good luck with that," the other whispered back, smirking. Trump took a moment to look at the staffer, then the crowd. "It's just a hat," he said evenly, before moving past him. The staffer stepped back, his shoulders stiff as he exchanged nervous glances with another staff member across the room. On stage, the event host cleared her throat and tapped the microphone, her smile practiced but strained. The room quieted as her voice carried. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone warm but firm, "thank you for being here tonight to support such an important cause. Let's focus on unity and the mission of giving every child a chance to succeed." Her eyes briefly lingered on Trump, though she said nothing more. The applause that followed was polite but brief, and conversations quickly resumed. At a nearby table, a man leaned toward his companion. "Did you see her glance at him?" "Hard to miss," the other replied. "Do you think he's going to listen?" Trump continued walking, unbothered by the shifting attention. Guests watched as he moved confidently through the room, some whispering while others simply observed. Behind him, the staffer exhaled sharply and rejoined his colleague. "What happened?" the colleague asked. "He didn't budge," the staffer said, shaking his head. "I don't think he's planning to." The colleague glanced toward Trump. "Well, this just got interesting." The ballroom pulsed with a quiet tension as the confrontation unfolded. Trump stood firm, his posture calm yet commanding, while the woman in the emerald green gown faced him with a composed but determined expression. The red MAGA hat between them seemed to radiate its own gravity, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Do you think this is appropriate here?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Her gesture toward the hat was subtle, but its meaning was clear. Trump met her gaze without hesitation. "Why wouldn't it be?" he replied, his tone measured. The room seemed to hold its breath. Near the bar, two men exchanged glances. "She's really going for it," one whispered. "She's not backing down," the other murmured, leaning closer. The woman straightened her shoulders, glancing briefly at the crowd before speaking again. "This is a charity gala," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're here to support unity, not to highlight division." Trump's brow shifted slightly, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the mixed reactions. Whispers spread like ripples on water, bouncing from table to table as guests leaned toward each other. "He's not going to let that slide," someone near the dessert table murmured. "You think he's going to argue?" their companion replied, eyes fixed on the scene. Before Trump could respond, the soft scrape of a chair echoed from the back of the room. Heads turned as an elderly man stood, his posture rigid and his movements deliberate. In his hand, he held a worn and weathered MAGA hat, its edges frayed. "That hat," the man said, his voice strong despite his age, "meant something to me when I came home." The room fell silent, every eye now on the veteran. His simple statement carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire space. The woman in green faltered, her confidence wavering. She turned slightly, glancing at the guests around her. Some avoided her gaze, while others nodded subtly toward the veteran. Trump stepped aside, his attention now focused on the man. He approached with steady steps, extending a hand as he reached him. The veteran met it with a firm grip, his expression unyielding but calm. "Thank you for standing up," someone near the back of the room whispered, their voice barely audible over the quiet murmurs. At the center of the ballroom, the handshake lingered, drawing a soft wave of applause. It started with a single clap from one table, then another, until the sound grew into a full wave of approval. The woman in green stepped back, her arms crossed tightly as she returned to her seat. The applause continued, hesitant at first, but growing louder as more guests joined in. Near the orchestra, a woman leaned toward her partner. "I didn't think it would go this way," she said quietly. "It's not just about the hat anymore," the partner replied, his gaze fixed on the veteran. At the dessert table, a group of younger attendees exchanged glances. One of them, a man in a sharp suit, spoke softly. "That man just changed the entire tone of the night." "He didn't even say much," another replied, shaking their head. But it was enough. The veteran returned to his seat, his weathered hat resting on the table in front of him. Trump stood for a moment longer, scanning the room as the applause finally began to subside. He turned to the veteran and gave him a small nod of respect before moving back toward the crowd. Around the room, conversations began to bubble again, but they were quieter, more thoughtful. At a corner table, a journalist scribbled furiously in her notebook, her words barely audible as she muttered to herself. "This is the story," she said. "Not the gala, not the donations, this moment." Beside her, a photographer adjusted his camera, capturing the lingering reactions of the guests. "It's not just about him anymore," he said, glancing toward Trump. Near the dessert table, a young woman turned to her companion. "Do you think this changes anything?" Her companion paused, watching as Trump continued to navigate the room. "It changes tonight," he said simply. As the orchestra resumed playing, the energy in the ballroom shifted once more. The applause had faded, but its impact remained etched into the atmosphere of the evening. The applause continued to ripple through the room, its energy contagious. Some clapped hesitantly, glancing around for cues, while others joined in more enthusiastically, their initial reservations fading. Conversations hushed as guests exchanged glances, the atmosphere shifting from tension to something almost reverent. Near the dessert table, two women leaned in close, their whispers barely audible over the sound of clapping. "Did you see the way the veteran stood up?" one asked, her tone filled with surprise. "Hard to miss," the other replied. "I didn't think anyone would defend that hat, let alone like that." In the center of the room, Donald Trump and the veteran stood side by side, their handshake lingering for a moment longer before they stepped back. Trump gestured subtly, encouraging the man to take his seat again. The veteran nodded once, his posture proud, before returning to his table. The simple exchange spoke volumes, drawing approving murmurs from nearby guests. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne paused mid-step, his gaze darting between Trump and the veteran. "Should I keep going?" he asked a colleague quietly. "Not yet," the other replied, shaking his head. Everyone's still watching. At the far end of the room, the host stood behind the podium, her hands gripping its edges as she observed the unfolding moment. She exchanged a quick glance with the event coordinator beside her. "Should I step in?" she whispered. The coordinator shook his head. "Not yet. Let them settle first." Guests at nearby tables leaned toward each other, speaking in hushed tones. "I didn't expect the room to react like this," a man murmured. "Well, they did," his companion replied. "It's like the whole event just shifted." The applause slowly faded, though the energy in the room remained charged. Trump turned, scanning the crowd with a measured gaze. His movements were deliberate, each step drawing the focus of everyone around him. A young couple near the bar watched as he approached a small group of attendees. "Is he going to say something?" the woman asked. "Doesn't look like it," the man replied. "But he doesn't need to." Trump stopped near a table where a younger man sat, his posture slightly hunched. The man hesitated before standing, extending his hand awkwardly. Trump shook it firmly, exchanging a brief nod with him before moving on. The simplicity of the gesture was enough to spark more quiet whispers. At another table, a journalist scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes darting between Trump and the room. "This isn't just about the gala anymore," she muttered. The photographer beside her adjusted his camera, snapping another shot. "You think this moment's going to make headlines?" he asked. The journalist looked up briefly, her expression certain. "It already has." As Trump made his way toward the stage, more guests began to murmur among themselves. "That was unexpected," someone near the dessert table said. "It's not about the hat now," another replied. "It's about standing for something." At the podium, the host tapped the microphone gently, drawing the crowd's attention. She smiled warmly, though the hint of unease in her eyes was noticeable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "let's take this moment to remember the mission of tonight's event, to give every child the chance to achieve their dreams. Together, we can make that happen." Polite applause followed, though it lacked the passion of the earlier moment. The host stepped back, glancing toward the event coordinator again. "She's trying to regain control," a guest whispered to their tablemate. "Good luck," the other replied. The applause faded once more as the orchestra began to play a soft, understated melody. Guests turned back to their conversations, but the energy had shifted. What began as a tense, divided evening now carried an undercurrent of reflection. Trump returned to his table, pausing briefly to acknowledge a few guests along the way. He stopped near the bar, where a man and woman stood watching him. The man extended a hand hesitantly, which Trump shook without hesitation. "Thank you," the man said quietly. Trump gave a small nod before continuing on. Near the back of the room, the veteran sat quietly, his weathered hat resting on the table in front of him. A young attendee approached, their movements tentative. "Sir," the attendee said softly, "what you did, it meant something." The veteran looked up, his expression calm but warm, and gave a slight nod. He didn't say a word, but the attendee smiled faintly before retreating. Across the ballroom, the buzz of quiet conversations continued. Guests weren't talking about the event's planned program anymore. They were talking about what they had just witnessed. "It's not often you see something like that," someone said near the orchestra. "No," their companion replied. "And I doubt we'll see it again." The evening pressed on, but the moment lingered, a lasting impression that refused to fade. Applause began hesitantly but grew louder as more guests joined in. The event host, visibly moved, stepped back to the microphone. "Tonight isn't about what divides us," she said, glancing at Trump and the veteran. "It's about what unites us, the hope we can give to the next generation." The evening ended on a high note, with record-breaking donations for underprivileged youth. As guests left, the conversation wasn't about the controversy but about the powerful reminder of what hope and unity could achieve.